This is the Comics Alternative, episode 197, reviews of Cousin Joseph, Bounty #1, and the Paybacks #1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week, Andy and I are going to discuss three really interesting titles. We're going to begin with Jules Feiffer's new graphic novel, Cousin Joseph. After that, we're going to look at issue #1 of Bounty, written by Kurtis Wiebe and art by Mindy Lee. And then after that, we're going to look at the first issue from Heavy Metal of The Paybacks, written by Donny, Cates and Eliot Rahal, with art by Geoff Shaw. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in every month, there's a load of bundles to take advantage of where you get a deeper discount on multiple comics from the same publisher than you would get if you bought those comics individually. And this time there are multiple bundles from DC Comics at 45 and 50%, as well as that include Vertigo, as well as Marvel Kids bundle, a double take trade paperback bundle at 55% off, and the usual Valiant bundle, where if you buy all 8 Valiant comics, you get 50% off.
Yeah, they have great deals every single month on bundles and on single issue or single text discounts. So go to the website and find out what those specials are for the month of July. That's dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
And that's not just something that we say on every episode. We really do mean it. If you guys use DCB service, and you should, we do. We highly recommend it. You can't beat the prices. When you order, send an email and tell them, hey, customer service, Andy and Derek, the two guys with the PhDs, suggested that we use you.
Yeah, do that.
That really helps.
Yeah, that helps let them know that their sponsorship of the podcast is working.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Andy, we have some really interesting text to discuss today, but before we do that, I think we should share some listener email that we received this past week.
Yeah, sounds great.
Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
This is from someone who's been listening to our show and every now and again writing us for quite a while, and this is Rock Langlois, and he sent us an email about last week's show where we discussed the recent comics adaptation of Albert Camus' The Rebel. He says, hey, I must admit you really impressed me with the Albert Camus review. I'm a fan of Camus since young age, and of course I ordered that book as soon as it went out. I did not receive it yet. I guess that I'll receive it with the next DCBS order. Can't wait to see it and read it. See? Rock. Orders from DCB Service. You guys should too.
Great.
Yeah. But he goes on to say, I really love the little Easter egg that you add in your comments about the Jean-Paul Sartre drawing in the last panel of the first part. I'll check on that. And then he goes on to say that both Sartre and Camus are some of his favorite writers, and he liked the fact that we spoke in a knowing way about them. He says, those kind of podcasts are the ones that put you one step above all the rest. Once again, I can only say one thing. Keep up the good work. Rock Langlois.
That's nice. So you and Jean should take that to heart.
Yes. That does make us feel good. And thank you, Rock, for the kind email and in a much broader way for listening to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Rock.
Well, Andy, let's discuss the books that we're going to be discussing for this week. And we're going to start off with the latest book from someone that you and I interviewed about 1.5 years ago, Jules Feiffer.
Yeah, before we actually get into the reviews, I just want to mention, I want to apologize in advance to our listeners. I've been moving into a new house all week, and I'm exhausted. So if I can't remember characters' names or I get punchy, then I apologize for that. And plus, this is bit of an experiment because I'm recording in my new office, which is a bit different of a setup from my old office. Plus, nothing is put away, or very little is put away, and moving 40 comic boxes up to a second floor office is a terrible idea. I would not recommend that to anybody.
That's where your new office is, on the second floor?
Yeah. But anyway, once it gets set up, it's going to be fantastic. But meanwhile, I'm probably not going to be 100% through this show. Well,
we have faith in you.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
We and the listeners.
Okay.
Or at least the listeners.
Yeah, so so we're going to start with Cousin Joseph.
Yeah.
The new graphic novel by Jules Feiffer. And as you mentioned, we talked to Jules Feiffer about 1.5 years ago about Kill My Mother, and this is not really a sequel, right? It's a prequel and also part of what's going to be a trilogy, because at the end it says that we're going to get Archie Goldman and the Decline of the West coming next.
Yeah. So, when we had Jules on back in November 2014, he did mention to us during that interview that this was going to be part of a trilogy. And when I originally read Kill My Mother, I didn't think of it as being the first part of a trilogy, because that could easily stand on its own. So in that interview, learning that this would be that book, Kill My Mother, would be the first of 3, was an extra added bonus to our appreciation of the book. In reading through Cousin Joseph, I think in many ways this stands alone, but more so than Kill My Mother, it is dependent on a follow-up. Because it kind of ends, and we will not give away any spoilers, but it ends in such a way that you're looking forward to more. Again, I think it's a satisfying ending, but it just makes sense that there's going to be a third book to follow this one.
Yeah. Now, I don't unfortunately have my copy of Kill My Mother handy, since it's in a box somewhere in this room. But Cousin Joseph takes place in 1931. Right. And so when does, refresh my memory, when does Kill My Mother take place?
The first part begins in 1933. Okay.
And then the next volume, the third volume, is going to take place in 1953. So it looks like we're jumping around in time a bit here.
Right. Now in Kill My Mother, it began in 33, but then as the narrative continued, it took us into the Second World War.
Right.
Yeah. And so if you've read Kill My Mother, and we should mention that both of these books are published by Liveright Publishing, which is an imprint of W.W. Norton. So if you've read Kill My Mother, you'll recognize many of the main characters in Cousin Joseph, but there are also quite a number of new ones. I think most memorable of the characters that we saw in Kill My Mother were Annie and Artie. When Kill My Mother first opens, we see Annie, a young girl, and Artie, her friend, dancing, and we first hear Annie say, "Shut up, Artie," and she continues saying that, and then that becomes a catchphrase for a successful radio show at the expense of Artie once he has grown up and now is in the military. But we get the same thing in Cousin Joseph, beginning in 1931. When we see Annie and Artie, Annie's telling Artie to shut up several times.
Right, and they're of course naturally younger here. They're in they're in high school.
Yeah, well, they're 2 years younger than when Kill My Mother started. But we also see, for a little while, she doesn't play a big part in this, Annie's mother, Elsie, which was a much more central character in Kill My Mother.
Right.
We also see the private eye that Elsie ended up working for, Neil, who at the time of Kill My Mother, he was a private eye, but in this current book, Cousin Joseph, he's in the process of leaving the police force, and he's going to open his own private eye office. So he plays a part here. But we also see, and this is like one of the main players of Cousin Joseph, Elsie's husband, Sam, and Annie's father, who is mentioned in Kill My Mother, but we never see him.
Right.
Yeah. And so we won't go into a lot of detail about what happens to Sam, but if you've read Kill My Mother, you probably have a sense of, in a general way, what happens. But Sam is definitely one of the main characters in Cousin Joseph. And it begins actually with this character, and we still don't know a lot about him, who this Cousin Joseph is. But someone who goes by the name of Cousin Joseph talking with his assistant about delivering a message to Sam, and that Sam is to continue doing what Cousin Joseph has been wanting him to do and what he's been asking him to do. And that is, I guess, in a general way, we can say lean on, or persuade, maybe nicely, if possible, certain Hollywood producers to make films that are very pro-American. And keep in mind, this is the early 1930s. We're just a couple of years into the Great Depression. There's the Red Scare of the 1920s, and so there's this sense of the communist infiltration of American culture. The revolutionaries who are making their presence known in the unions and agitating things. And so there's a lot of politics in this book that if you know anything about the 1920s, 1930s, the interwar periods, then, all of this makes sense. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed about Cousin Joseph, that even more so than in Kill My Mother, Jules Feiffer definitely embeds his narrative within a thick historical context or contexts.
Yeah, that's right. And so actually that gets to one of my earliest thoughts or questions about this book as I was reading it. So you mentioned in your summary there that Cousin Joseph tries to encourage pro-American content in the film industry, but he's also trying to discourage what he sees as anti-American content. And that's where a lot of these bribes come in, is when an announcement comes from that a studio is going to make a movie that might be pro-union or even pro-immigration in some ways. And he sends Sam Hannigan to deliver a music box that contains the bribe in it, to get these movies shut down before they go into production. And so part of what Feiffer seems to be saying here is that the film industry has been kind of manipulated by these outside forces, and we really don't know who Cousin Joseph works for, if he works for anybody.
We do know that he has a thick accent.
Right.
That he tries to mask.
Right. And that But what I wonder is, in 1931, we're in that era of film history where it's before the production code. And so there's a lot of movies in which kind of anything goes. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, but I don't have enough of a kind of comprehensive sense of what movies were like in 1931 to know is this the case? I mean, were movies in the early 1930s sanitized of this kind of political content in order for this the story to have a sense of verisimilitude? Did we just get in 1931 a lot of movies that didn't question a certain kind of American values and patriotism?
Yeah, well, I mean, and this is really interesting because what Sam Hannigan and Cousin Joseph talk about is, well, their sense of what is pro-American,
right,
or even anti-American, and the way that they're discussing this, and what the filmmakers are doing, is they're making films that are not necessarily uplifting and point out all the great things about America and the American way of life, but they're showing the darker side of life in America. But my guess is that these are the kind of films that Kornblum, who becomes, I guess, the central figure when regarding the producers, he's the one that Hannigan goes to lean on quite significantly, becomes an important part of the story. He comes up with a script, and I mean, it definitely is pro-American. I think by anybody's definition, and it's something that definitely persuades Sam. But Cousin Joseph is still suspicious. Anything that doesn't paint, I guess, what we could, loosely call, kind of a typical Hollywood film where, everything is happy and sunshiny and there's, a good ending where everyone is happy and gets along. If it's nothing sanitized like that, then it's something that's produced by these agitators, by outside forces. It's not showing America at its best. But what producers like Kornblum is arguing is that even showing the less attractive side of life in the United States is definitely considered a pro-American stance. And so that leads us to this this kind of staunch pro-American, maybe even nativist attitude that starts to come to the fore later in the 1930s, an isolationist attitude that is very suspicious of anything from the outside. And, getting back to your earlier speculation about the historical accuracy of some of the films in the early 1930s, I mean, I'm like you, I don't know. I would bet money that this is the way that many of these films were, because as you pointed out, kind of anything goes, right? So I'm sure that it's that anything goes part before the code that is upsetting Cousin Joseph and also Sam as well. But to me, where this gets really interesting is when issues of anti-Semitism starts to come into play.
Yeah, I mean, to go back before we get to anti-Semitism, 1931 is the rise of the universal horror film comes during that time, but also Charlie Chaplin did City Lights and what else? There were several different what was the other one I was trying to think of? Oh yeah, the gangster film comes into play with Public Enemy.
Right.
So what I'm wondering is Feiffer here making an argument about the history of Hollywood that actually does hold up to Hollywood history? Do we see this kind of sanitization of Hollywood products in this period that Cousin Joseph is kind of the force behind, or is that a construction of Feiffer's? But the anti-Semitism is, of course, an interesting thing, because there's the big speech that Cousin Joseph gives at one point about how, when Jewish immigrants came to the United States, whoever the kind of forces are that Cousin Joseph represents allowed them to have the film industry. Mm-hmm. And they did things with the film industry that the powers that be had not anticipated were going to happen, especially in defining what America was. And this is something that Cousin Joseph is responding against. And I think that part is very interesting, because that is accurate, that Jewish immigrants were at the head of the major studios at this time.
Right, and to a much greater degree than the case was with comics, right? I mean, right. Film was an industry that no one really had much interest in, and it was something for immigrants, especially Jewish immigrants, to come in and to make their own, right? Because you don't have the competition that you would have in other industries that are already well established. So then they start to, make films. They start to, get the public's attention. And I mean, that's what Cousin Joseph says, when we weren't looking, they started to take control of the message. And,
right.
Now that they're in, we have to make sure that that message is the right one to get out. And then what Feiffer does in Cousin Joseph is it links this kind of attitude about the film industry with anti-Semitism, and not just in the United States, but globally. The fact that that the Jews who were emigrating into a particular country, the United States or elsewhere, they were bringing with them certain influences, and those are going to be of the reddish variety.
All right.
Because where did the revolution first take hold? In Eastern Europe, in Russia. Mm-hmm. Where was much of the agitation taking place before that? In Germany, and in the surrounding areas. And this is where many of the Jewish immigrants were coming from. So especially as we get toward the end of the book, where Cousin Joseph is trying to bring Sam into his understanding, because Sam, after, this really big and persuasive speech, which is a supposed script that Kornblum gives him, is won over by this immigrant success story. Mm-hmm. And Cousin Joseph is arguing, see, that's how the Jews are. They'll tell you that something is uplifting. They'll tell you that something is healthy. And that's how they get the public to relax its guard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I found that aspect of the historical argument about Hollywood probably the most compelling. Mm-hmm.
But also in terms of we were talking about the history when it comes to the labor movement in the United
right.
States, which really came to the fore during the 1930s, and we see that fairly early on. I think. The book begins within the first several pages with the possibility of a big strike at an industry called Knox Works. Mm-hmm. And the man who owns this business is, his name is Knox, and he is in cahoots with the police, and also we find out in some ways Cousin Joseph, but those links are a little fuzzy. And what they're going to do is they're going to break up, as what happened historically, they're going to break up the unions with a combination of scabs and the police force, established power.
Right.
And this is what happens. But it's not so much the Jews who are the agitators on the union level. This is primarily, other immigrants, the Irish.
Right.
Because the ringleader is Billy Doyle, and there are others who are, obviously by their name, at least seem Irish. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think that's one of the things that makes Kornblum's imagined script at the end that he gives Sam in order to save his own life. This is a film that I'm going to be making, and he brings together everyone in America for an uplifting message in this film that he's thinking about creating, or at least he says to Sam that, it's the film that he plans on making. And it brings together immigrants from all over. So it's kind of a big blue marble approach to what makes America great. People coming from all different backgrounds, different religions, different beliefs, different experiences, different cultures. And that's what makes us so strong.
Yeah. That's another thing, that plot of that movie seems all over the place.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine what that movie, that Kornblum pitches would even look like, because it goes through multiple. It feels like 3 movies.
Oh yeah,
in a sense.
and we should mention, and this is not a spoiler in any way, but later in the book, Cousin Joseph sends Sam to lean hard on Kornblum, who doesn't seem to be swayed by his music boxes with the money in it. He takes the money, but he still wants to do his own thing. And so Cousin Joseph sends Sam to really get to Kornblum, to threaten him. And
right.
So under threat of death, Kornblum comes up with this really wild narrative that, you're right, seems to be not just one, but several movies wrapped into one. And his plot changes. It's very fluid as it develops, because he's trying to save his own skin. So he's saying whatever will get him out of that situation alive. So much of it is all over the place. A lot of it is very cheesy, but it strikes me as the kind of film that definitely could be made in Hollywood.
Yep.
And was made. So, there's a lot going on in this book, and I know that there were a lot of moving parts in Kill My Mother. You and I were talking right before we pressed record today, in that neither of us had the time to go back and reread Kill My Mother. But I wish I had the time to do so, because I just get a sense that Cousin Joseph, I don't know if I want to call it a more ambitious book, but there seems to be more going on in Cousin Joseph than in Kill My Mother.
That's interesting that you say that, because I think there's more going on in terms of the depth of the story, the ideas, and as you described, the thickness of the history that he's using. But I found I like Kill My Mother, but I found Cousin Joseph to be a more compelling narrative and a more coherent narrative, cohesive. I think that I thought that Kill My Mother kind of devolves into chaos towards the end, but that may be part of the intention of what Feiffer's doing, because of the kind of Hollywood genres that he's tapping into with Kill My Mother, and so it gets pretty madcap at the end. Whereas Cousin Joseph is feels a bit more tightly connected to, say, the kind of noir and crime stories that, well, don't really happen until later in the 30s or early 40s, but feels like it has a more kind of linear and coherent narrative, and the pieces all seem to fall into place fairly well. So I actually ended up, after reading Cousin Joseph, liking Cousin Joseph better than Kill My Mother. That's not to say that I don't like Kill My Mother, but I think this is definitely a more cohesive narrative.
Do you think it's a more mature narrative?
Well, it's interesting to call, to identify Jules Feiffer at this stage in his career as maturing from one project to the next. But, when we interviewed him, it did feel like, from the things he was saying, that he had this renewed energy in his in productivity that Kill My Mother brought about. And inspiring him to, at this stage in his career, to produce this really ambitious trilogy. And I get the feeling that Cousin Joseph is more of a product of that enthusiasm and that energy. If that makes any sense, that kind of he discovered that during the process of Kill My Mother, and it becomes more fully realized with Cousin Joseph.
Yeah, and he even suggests as much in the acknowledgments at the end of Cousin Joseph, where he says this accidental noir trilogy that began with Kill My Mother and will end with the Ghost script could never have been conceived or illustrated were I still living out a life of quiet resignation in Manhattan. The fortuitous circumstances that led to my abandoning the city for the East End of Long Island, where I found a new life, new friends, and new career as graphic novelist, no more than an extension of the adventure newspaper strip cartoonist that I wanted to be as a boy, now brings me as much or more pure joy than any time in my life. So, like he told us in the interview, he's saying here in the acknowledgments that this is in some ways kind of a new Jules Feiffer. But before Kill My Mother, he was not known as, I guess, what we could call a graphic novelist. I mean, the closest thing he came to that was the book Tantrum. But to call that a graphic novel, I guess you could. But that seemed more like an extended Feiffer strip to me.
Right. That's
I liked
interesting.
It,
yeah, because I have the advanced reading copy of Cousin Joseph. I did not get the final version like you did, so this doesn't have the acknowledgments in it.
Oh, it doesn't. Oh,
no. But also, you mentioned what do the acknowledgments say is the title of the third book?
The Ghost script.
That's interesting because at the end of the ARC, the third book, it says to be concluded in Book 3, 1953, Archie Goldman and the Decline of the West.
Wow. That's interesting. And, I was sent an advanced reader's copy of that as well. But then once I got the finished book,
right.
I didn't go back and look at that galley. So at very end of the book, and this is on page 111, it says, to be concluded, the Ghost script. So earlier in our discussion, when you mentioned the title of your book, I wondered if maybe I had missed something, and so I didn't say anything. I thought, maybe I misread it, that it was the Ghost script. But so that's one of the reasons why an advanced reader's copy is not the final copy.
Right.
You have to keep that in mind.
Yeah. But, I always wonder, for as comic scholars and as people who do also archival research, that is something that makes the galleys or the advanced readers copies valuable for research, is that there are these changes. There are sometimes significant changes that get made between that and the final published version.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to compare these side by side now, because I was noticing reading along that there were some there were quite a few actually typos in the ARC and things like that. So I wonder if other major changes were made.
Huh. I'll have to get my advanced reader's copy out and just compare them.
Yeah.
This is kind of a side topic, but we get every now and again advanced readers' copies of comics or graphic novels from various publishers. I feel mixed about that. On the one hand, I'm thankful that as members of the media, as we are, that we are on certain publishers' mailing list, and we do get those books. So we
right.
find out about them ahead of our listeners, or earlier than many people would. And so I think that's great. On the other hand, if there's any color in any of these advanced readers copies, then it's usually, a monochromatic. And if it's a color comic, and they do that for economical reasons, and I can understand that, because it's more expensive to print galleys in advanced readers copies than it is the finished book.
Right.
And in fact, when I worked at Simon & Schuster, we tried to be stingy with galleys because they were much more expensive to put out, even though, in terms of production quality, it didn't stand up to the finished book. But if you don't have that color in the reader's copy, the advanced reader's copy, you kind of lose out on much of what the comic is all about. The color.
Right.
But
so I didn't get any of that.
Oh.
Sorry.
Well, the color is probably not that different from the advanced reader's copy. It's very similar to what you'll find in Kill My Mother.
Okay.
So, in fact, I've got my copy of Kill My Mother right here. And, yeah, if he's not using grays, then there's some blues intermixed with the grays, some maybe light green or tannish colors. You don't have the blues in Cousin Joseph, but you do get the grays and the browns and tans.
Yeah.
In places. So yeah. Yeah, I'm impressed, and I'm very much looking forward to this third book, The Ghost Strip, and I'm wondering how reading that book will change our approach or our appreciation of the first two. You know, for instance, you were, both of us were pointing out some of the differences we saw between Kill My Mother and Cousin Joseph. You know, one being a little more cohesive, another being more free for all. But I'm wondering if those opinions will be tempered a bit once we see this third book.
Right.
That could put the others into context.
Mm-hmm.
Good stuff.
Yes.
Yes. So another great book from Jules Feiffer. The only Academy Award winner we have interviewed on the Comics Alternative.
Right.
Okay, you want to move on to the second title of the week.
Yeah, so next we're going to be discussing Bounty, which is coming out from Dark Horse.
Right.
And before we get into the plot summary, I wanted to ask you, have there been other Bounty stories before this? Do you know?
As far as I know, this is the very first.
Okay, because the this first issue starts in kind of I wouldn't even say in medias res. It starts out pretty far along in the story of the two main characters, the sisters Nina and Georgie. And even on the first page of the book, it gives a kind of summary of what has gone on before, which made me wonder if there had been a previous issue or miniseries or something that I wasn't aware of. But as the book goes along, we kind of are getting to see why Wiebe has chosen this or made this narrative choice, because what happens in the opening scene changes Nina and Georgie's lives and careers dramatically. They are, at the beginning, the most successful criminals around in the galaxy, and they're when we meet them at the beginning of this book, they've been caught,
right?
And they have to make a kind of dramatic choice that changes their lives and career. And so after that opening scene, it jumps ahead to just years later, it says, and now Nina and Georgie are bounty hunters in a world, in this futuristic world in which bounty hunters seem to be among the top celebrities in the world.
Right. Which reminds us of some of the reality shows that have been on over the past 10, 15 years.
Sure.
The most, I guess, famous is Dog Bounty Hunter.
Yeah.
And there's much of that tone in here. Now, you mentioned this being a futuristic story. It does take place in 2205, and that's not that far into the future. And I like that fact, right? So Wiebe didn't play it safe by setting it in, let's say, the year 3000 some. We're in the 2000s, but it's not even 200 years in the future, and look where we are here. So I appreciate that. And we should mention that this is written by Kurtis Wiebe, and the art is by Mindy Lee, colors by Leonardo Olia. By the way, I wanted to ask, is the name pronounced Wiebe or Wiebe? I've heard both.
I've always heard the way you've been pronouncing it.
Wiebe?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I really like Wiebe's Rat Queen. Mm-hmm. Rat Queens. Did you like that?
Yeah, I'm behind on it. I've read the first trade, but I did like it. Mm-hmm. I think readers going into Bounty maybe expecting it to be a futuristic sci-fi version of Rat Queens will not have their expectations met.
Exactly. Yeah, because I went into it feeling that way. Did you?
Yeah, because we have a cast of primarily female protagonists, which is consistent with Rat Queens. But what really feels like is missing here is the humor of Rat Queens, and especially the more, I don't know, kind of scatological type stuff, or whatever you want to call it, that goes on in Rat Queens.
I agree. And I mean, there are things to laugh about in Bounty #1, but not near enough that you would find in almost any issue of Rat Queens.
Right.
So yeah, I definitely felt that difference. And another difference I felt between this first issue and, let's say, Rat Queens #1 is something that you alluded to earlier, in that with Bounty, we're thrown into the middle of the story. So it took me a while to get my narrative sea legs. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have that very first page that sets a context, right? You got a little exposition. Sisters Nina and Georgie are the most reviled anti-corporate criminals in the galaxy. Over 5 years, they've stolen money from the most evil corporations and dispersed that money between themselves and the poor. In doing this, they became the biggest bounty reward the universe has ever known. But when a mission turns out to be a clever trap, the sisters find themselves in a life or death situation. And when I first read this, I felt that this is something that would be written in an issue that continues the story, that there had to be an earlier manifestation of Bounty in some form before this. But as far as I know, this is the first issue of Bounty. This is the first time that Wiebe and Lee have done anything with these characters and this premise. And we know that because toward the end of the book, the last several pages is the pitch that Wiebe and Lee gave to Dark Horse to get them this series. So this is something that they'd been working on. This is their first shot. But you're right. It does sound from that exposition on the very first page that this is something we're coming into cold, but there's probably something before this. And I think that threw me. And it took me a while into this first issue, definitely by the, even into pages 5 or 6, I felt a little unsteady in understanding what was going on. And so I had to reread some of those pages 2 or 3 times just to get a sense of things and to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. Because from that very first page with the exposition, I had a feeling that I may be missing something.
All right. Yeah, and not only that, but when we get that transition into a few years later, we get a completely new character that we haven't seen before, and she seems to be I'm not really exactly sure what she's doing, but it might be in a virtual world of some kind that this is happening.
Yeah.
She's dropped into a fishbowl, but that fish, whatever is going on inside that fishbowl, seems essential to the bounty hunting mission that her partners are on, and her partners include Nina and Georgie in their new status quo as bounty hunters. So I'm not real sure. So that transition took some adjustment as well. With Rat Queens, I read the first trade, so I didn't read that in individual issues, and I thought it was a good trade. It was a good collection. We talk about this sort of thing a lot when we review single issues. I have a feeling that Bounty may work better as a trade than it does in single issues.
Yeah. When I've read Rat Queens in single issues, and I felt that, if I can remember back then, that the issues did a pretty good job of standing on their own while at the same time being part of a larger story arc. I don't get it like you. I don't get a sense that this is the case with Bounty #1, that it probably will read better in trade. And I agree completely with you. After this opening scene, which again I had to go back and reread some of the pages a couple of times to make sure that I understood what was going on. Then when we have, I don't know, maybe about 10 pages in, there is this shift in time, and we're told that because years later is written in the first panel. And we do get someone who is on Nina and Georgie's team who seems to be psychic or has some kind of internet-based, if we want to call it that, digital awareness and powers. What is that character's name? I can't remember.
I can't remember either.
Okay. But yeah, she's in this big fishbowl, and sometimes when she is drawn, she and the world around her seem a little thin, a little airy, which makes me wonder if she's virtually tapping into whatever it is that's going on. I mean, that seems to be the case. I don't see her as a ghostly presence. But yeah, that first scene, first 2 pages of the fishbowl event threw me, and I did not know what was going on. I knew that it was a jump ahead several years, but other than that, I was clueless. And so maybe this will make more sense when we look at the first story arc in the first trade of Bounty. I mean, I like this well enough. I think it has a lot of potential, but I don't know. On its own, I just feel that I don't have a complete grasp of this first issue.
Yeah, not only that, I don't know if I have a complete grasp of this world either. And I think part of that is the confusion I had with the character I think her name is Viv. Viv, tapped into the virtual world,
right?
But that part of the plot, a dramatic, what appears to be a dramatic and important moment in the plot is when the target of their bounty hunt takes Nina's picture and sends it somewhere, and we find out where later. And that seems to be a big deal that happened. And I'm not really quite clear on what makes that such a big deal that she has her picture taken there, especially when later on in the story, or in the second story that we get in this issue, Nina is flying through the air and posing for pictures that everybody in the crowd are taking. So if it's a problem that Nina gets her picture taken and gets sent, and then gets sent to this other person, well, it would seem like her picture is probably all over the internet, or whatever constitutes the internet in this future world.
Right.
So I'm curious as to how Bounty, it seems like one of the themes of Bounty is not just kind of celebrity culture, but also looking at a future of social media, and especially an absence of privacy, and how how that is affecting these characters. So I'll be curious to see how that plays out. But right now, as far as that kind of world building is concerned, I'm not quite clear as to what's going on, and it's not a matter of feeling like, oh well, I just have to have confidence that we'll learn more. It's more of like a kind of genuine confusion that's a bit discouraging.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if, from what you've just said, if some of the confusion may be generated by the inclusion of that story at the end. And, this is the one that is kind of a short narrative that was part of their pitch to Dark Horse. And, I appreciate that. It does give us some insight into their development of this narrative world, but it points out how things have changed. Because you're right, when it comes to the character Nina, in the pitch story, the shorter one that's at the very end of this first issue, she is more of a public figure posing for pictures, and you get a much different feel for her and her sister Georgie in the first story or the first issue proper. And so I think that may cause a little bit of confusion. So on the one hand, if you love process, then the inclusion of the pitch story at the end you'll love. But I can see where it could potentially cause confusion. And in fact, when I saw this first issue and noticed that it was over 30 pages long, or about 30, 40 pages long, I thought, great, this is another one of those Image first issues where the creators are giving us a lot of bang for our buck in issue number 1. But it's not really the case. So.
Yeah, I think that text page that separates the story proper from this pitch story could have been clearer, as the text says, you'll notice some big design changes were made to the characters before they became their final versions. But I wish there had been more of a sense of more explanation as to, this story does not take place in Bounty continuity.
Right.
There was at least a statement about that would help, because then if we're reading it as a separate story to detail the process of how Bounty came about, then that confusion about Nina getting her picture taken in the story proper versus her celebrity status in that second story is clarified. So anyway, I'm curious about that. One other thing I did want to say about this book, we haven't really mentioned Mindy Lee's art, and she's got a real dynamic style that reminds me a bit of Arnold and Jacob Pander with more manga influence. If that makes any sense to anybody who knows the Pander brothers and their work, especially on say Matt Wagner's Grendel, for example.
Okay.
So there is it's a manga-esque style, but I think it's got this other element to it, and I don't know if they are directly influenced by the Pander brothers or not, but it's not quite a pure manga style.
Right, but I agree. I mean, you could tell, as with many artists. Now, Lee's by far not the minority here. Many contemporary artists are influenced in one form or another by manga. Either in terms of the dynamism, which you definitely see here,
right,
or by character type, right, with certain features. And a great example of that is Brian Lee O'Malley.
Sure.
In what we see in his early comics, but. Yeah, I really did appreciate Mindy Lee's art. I think that's one of the best parts of this. And again, I'm not to take anything away from the story of the first issue, but given the both of our takes on this, what we've already mentioned, I feel like I need more in order to appreciate what's going on in this first issue. But I think if we just look at it in terms of the art, I mean, this is definitely a very strong first issue.
Well, I with the art, though, I did find there's to be some kind of glitchy storytelling issues, especially when we get into fight scenes. I occasionally had difficulty kind of figuring out where where the action was taking place. Like, for example, the big fight scene that leads to the capture of the Bounty, about the middle of the book. Lee alternates panels between two of the bounty hunters that are fighting this group, and I often got confused as to how the action was flowing, because, for example, Nina would there'd be an image of Nina pulling back her fists, but then the next image would be of her partner actually punching somebody.
Right. Now that partner, his name, because he is the significant other of Georgie.
Right.
What's his name? Dan?
Well, yeah, I think so. They're Red Hawk and the Sparrow as their public persona, and that's part of where a lot of the humor comes in, is the way Nina kind of plays with the Sparrow's name, I guess. So aside from a few, again, especially in action scenes, glitchy storytelling moments, I did find the art to be compelling.
Yeah, I see that fight scene in particular that you'd mentioned, and I wasn't so much thrown by that. I could see what Lee was doing there. I just had to make sure. For me, it was making sure that Sparrow was the character that we see, because sometimes when you see him from the front, you don't see this. I don't even know how to describe it. Whatever it is on the back of his helmet.
Right.
Looks almost like a tail. But when you see him from behind, you definitely see that. So it took me a couple of takes to realize that, that is Sparrow from behind. And I just didn't recognize that thing on the back of his helmet. But yeah, I see what you're saying, going from one panel where one action is about to take place, and then in the next panel you see the other character who is throwing a punch or making a kick. Can be a little, if not off-putting, then throwing you a tad off visual balance.
Right.
Well, you want to look at the other number one issue that we're looking at for this week. And this both is and isn't a number one issue.
All right.
Technically, this is the Paybacks number one, written by Donny, Cates and Eliot Rahal, with art by Geoff Shaw. But in some ways, this is the fifth issue of the Paybacks. So it was last year that issues 1 through 4 of the Paybacks was published by Dark Horse. And I don't know about you, but I hadn't read that Dark Horse run of the Paybacks before this Heavy Metal number one issue, because this is published by Heavy Metal before this one came out. Had you read any of the Paybacks earlier?
No, I had not. Okay. So I did read them into reading this issue. Right. I did go back and read them, but I did not. I did not read the miniseries when it initially came out. But one of the things I was curious about is how well this new Paybacks number one might hold up as a first issue. If you were a new reader and you came to this fresh without having read the previous series, would it make sense?
Yeah, and there was a part of me that was hoping that you wouldn't have read the Dark Horse Paybacks, so then we could get a sense of what a reaction might be for a reader who didn't read that earlier series. I read that, those first 4 issues from Dark Horse before I read this number one issue from Heavy Metal. And I felt that the transition from issue number 4 of the Dark Horse to issue number 1 of Heavy Metal was really nice. I mean, I think it worked well, and it picks up where the earlier Dark Horse series left off. But I'm wondering if someone who did not read last year's the Paybacks, or it started last year, if they come cold to the Heavy Metal number one of the Paybacks, if they're going to feel like they're missing out on something. I think that they might, but I don't know because, I've read, before I read the first number one from Heavy Metal, the previous.
I think it would be I think there's a significant learning curve. It does look like Cates and Rahal are conscientious of that, in that this story opens with one of the characters, Dr. Black, who's spelled B-L-A-Q-K, who is a kind of Doctor Strange mystic type, and in fact, we'll get into this later, but Cates and Rahal are really working with archetypes of superheroes throughout this work. But he's basically giving a kind of training video for new members of the Paybacks organization. And so that does give a new reader some exposition, but that training video is being watched by a character called the Matador, who was part of the climax of the previous issue, and so his joining the Paybacks was really dealt with in that previous miniseries. And then when we see the other group of main characters, they're at a funeral for a character who died at the end of the previous miniseries. So and we deal with the impact of that death on this group. And so I think someone coming cold to this number one issue would not really get the connection or the emotional impact that these characters were feeling over this death.
Right. Now, one of the things we can say about Cates and Rahal is they do a really good job both in this Heavy Metal number one issue and in all four of the Dark Horse issues of giving us a first page that gives a bit of exposition, previously what happened. And not only that, but we get a rundown of the main characters. And the thing that I love about their writing is that with each issue, with the four Dark Horses and now this Heavy Metal number one issue, the description and the context for the main characters, they all change. Mm-hmm. And so it's not as if they just reprint a character description from the previous issues. Mm-hmm. They write something new, and this something new is almost always funny. In fact, we were talking about Wiebe and humor with Rat Queens and not coming out near as much with Bounty. I think that in all 5 issues now of the Paybacks, and the one we're focusing on specifically is the new number one from Heavy Metal, this is a funny title. I love their sense of humor.
Yeah, it is a funny title, and I think to give the reader or give listeners a sense of what is going on in the Paybacks. So this superhero team known as the Paybacks work for a man named Mr. Pierce, and Mr. Pierce basically is a loan shark on a high level who funds superhero activities. So and as I said before, this works with archetypes or analogs, really, of well-known superheroes. So you get versions of Batman in the Night, spelled N-I-G-H-T, K-N-I-G-H-T, Superman through High Guard, and so on. A little bit of the Fantastic Four with the Destruction Family, and basically, Mr. Pierce is the guy that funds all of these superheroes, rather than, say, Bruce Wayne or Reed Richards being independently wealthy. They have to go get loans from this guy. And when the loans come due, there are pretty harsh consequences. And so the Paybacks are basically the repo arm of Pierce's organization, where these superheroes go, and not only did they repossess the property that has been purchased with the money that Mr. Pierce provided, but they also, in a sense, repossess the superhero and require that superhero to work off his or her debt by becoming a member of the Paybacks.
Exactly. So in that first Dark Horse issue of the Paybacks, the target one of the targets that they go after is this character that you mentioned, Night Knight. And again, I love that name. But after this first issue, he becomes a member of the Paybacks reluctantly, and we find out that everyone, or almost everyone who's in the Paybacks, they're doing so reluctantly. Yeah, and in fact, on that very first issue, I pulled it up, of Paybacks #1, the way that they describe the setup on that exposition page, on the very first page, is invisible jets, suits of armor, big, ridiculous caves filled with toys. Let's face it, being a superhero is expensive. Sometimes heroes take out loans to pay for their super stuff, but when they can't pay those loans off, they get a visit from the world's first and best super repo team, the Paybacks. So that's basically the premise, what you've just described. And so in those first 4 issues from Dark Horse, we learn about the group dynamics. We learn about the genesis of the Paybacks, a little bit about Mr. Pierce, but not much, because even by the time we get to this Heavy Metal #1 issue, still a mysterious figure. But the team acquires new members, but we find out in that first run for Dark Horse that there was someone, we don't know who yet, or at least in the Dark Horse series, for most of that 4-issue run, who is killing off some of these superheroes who owe money to Mr. Pierce. And so the Paybacks are attempting to find their targets in order to repossess the things that they bought and to take them into the Paybacks. But sometimes when they reach their target, they find that their target has been killed.
Yep, and killed pretty brutally with a message written on the wall, "Payback's a bitch." So yeah, and so that premise creates an interesting dynamic between these team members, because for the most part, most of them don't get along. They're being forced together. They don't want to be there. So the idea of teamwork becomes a real challenge when that is the case. But Cates and Rahal are also playing around with making kind of commentary on the superhero genre. Now, there have been a lot of comics over the last 20, almost 30 years with the kind of advent of Watchmen, in which we deal with analogs to contemporary, to other, especially Marvel and DC superheroes, from Astro City through The Authority, and so on. So for a lot of readers, there may be a bit of a kind of burnout on that kind of commentary. But I think that Cates and Rahal do give this an interesting spin. They're having fun with it. Each character does kind of represent a specific, either an analog for a specific hero, like Night Knight being Batman and Highguard being Superman, and so on, or an archetype. Blood Pouch is pretty much a variety of different 90s Marvel characters that we can all pick out, and so on. But also there's other things going on. So there's also the kind of what if there was somebody who was funding all the superheroes through this loan shark system, and what would that look like? And so that's the kind of high concept pitch. But we also get in this first issue of the Heavy Metal series another question, which would be something like, what would WikiLeaks look like in a world with superheroes? and that's where it seems like this series is going.
Right. Yeah, you're right in pointing out that over the past 20 to 30 years, we have had a lot of comics like this that are, parodic takes of either superheroes in a general sense or analogs in some sort. One of the things, I could see where readers could pick this up, especially if they haven't picked up the earlier Dark Horse series, and think, okay, here we go again with another one of these comics that's making fun of the superhero genre or having fun at the expense. Kind of an easy target, yes. Mm-hmm. But what stood out for me with the Paybacks, both in the Dark Horse and in this new Heavy Metal series, is the humor. And I think that the way that the story is told, the way that Cates and Rahal show interaction between these characters, their relationships, the scenarios, and just even the basis of the characters themselves. Sometimes it gets rather wild, and I really do appreciate that sense of humor. And for me, that really stands out. And I think you could pick this up and think, okay, this is doing something that's nothing new, but it's the humor that refreshes things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think this book is generally funny, and this this particular narrative does really get going into an interesting place when we get to by the time we get to the end of this new first issue, and so I am really curious to see where this series is going, and in fact, I feel like this Heavy Metal issue is an improvement over the Dark Horse series. The Dark Horse series seems to put the pieces in place that we need to have in place for this, which is a story that's heading in a much more interesting direction.
Yeah. I don't know if, for me, I would say that, I like where this Heavy Metal #1 issue goes better than where the Dark Horse goes, because I think we couldn't have this new series from Heavy Metal without having that initial 4-issue run with Dark Horse. But I will say that both Cates and Rahal are taking this into a more ambitious territory that they probably couldn't at Dark Horse just because they were setting up their narrative. So now that that's done, then things can get even more interesting than it was before.
Mm-hmm. But I get a sense, like in comparing this with Bounty, it feels like Wiebe did away with the first miniseries in a sense that put the pieces into place and just gave us a little kind of exposition summary, and then jumped into the place where it becomes the most interesting for these characters.
Right.
I wouldn't say that the first miniseries of the Paybacks is unnecessary, but it does put the pieces in place for a more interesting narrative, for me anyway.
Yeah. Another thing that is very notable about this #1 issue is this is part of an initiative of Heavy Metal to come out with ongoing series. Right. And this, unless I'm unaware of it, this is the first time that Heavy Metal has done something like this. Outside of the Heavy Metal magazine itself. And of course, we've had, longer stories that have been earlier collected in issues of Heavy Metal, but has Heavy Metal put out individual ongoing series of comic books, just as, let's say, Dark Horse or Image or Marvel or DC do?
I really couldn't tell you. This does feel like, though, it's a bigger initiative than anything we might have seen in the past, if there is anything out there, because there's about half a dozen series or so coming out from Heavy Metal, including not just Paybacks, but including also Hoax Hunters. And so I find it interesting that with those two series in particular, Heavy Metal has picked up books from another publisher. Mm-hmm. And have included them in with their first batch.
Mm-hmm. And, I get the sense from looking at some of the titles, and we get this in the back of this first issue of the Paybacks, is these other heavy metal titles that we can expect in the coming months. You mentioned Hoax Hunters. There's also Heathen, and in fact, Heathen is a title that Sabrina, who's the manager of my local shop, collected. She's mentioned on our on-location shows a couple of times. So I know that when I was there last week, or maybe a week and a half ago, for the July show, she was excited by the fact that heavy metal is picking up Heathen. But there's Court of the Dead, Reincarnate, and The Atoll. So, this strikes me now that heavy metal comics may be another example of what we saw earlier in the year with Aftershock.
Sure.
A place where creators who, had been publishing through the Big Two or through Image, this is just another opportunity or another avenue for them. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the series, these new series and others to come through Heavy Metal Comics, is going to have a feel very much like what we've been seeing for the past several months from Aftershock.
Yeah, and it does feel like that's already the case.
Yeah. And I'm wondering how much of this initiative is brought about by Grant Morrison being the new editor-in-chief of Heavy Metal Magazine.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would get a sense that there might be that might not be a coincidence.
Right, because I wonder, because I think the official title of the publisher title of these new series is Heavy Metal Comics. Mm-hmm. So I wonder what the relationship is between these series, the publishing of these series, and the editor-in-chief role that Grant Morrison has recently assumed at Heavy Metal Magazine.
Right.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see if this was, in many ways, part of him coming on board, how much of a hand he had in it, or if this was a direction that they were planning before he became editor-in-chief.
Mm-hmm. Before we move too far away from the comic itself, I did want to say something about Geoff Shaw's art in this, because I really like Geoff Shaw's art. It has a real dynamic quality. It's not hyper realistic, so I think a lot of the facial expressions come off really well. But it does remind me a bit of now I'm forgetting his name.
You're going to say Sean Murphy?
Sean Murphy. Yeah.
Yes, I thought the exact same thing. And that's not to say that Geoff Shaw is derivative. It's just looking at the art. I think one could, with a quick glance, wonder, oh, did Sean Murphy do this? Mm-hmm. But it does have that kind of feel. So, it is more realistic without being too photographic, I guess, in its representation. So the way that especially the character faces are drawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the art, Shaw's art in this issue of Paybacks, and of course the first four from Dark Horse, really a big selling point of this series. So you have the writing team with, I think, a really good story, great concept, and wonderful humor especially. And then that is really underscored, the strength of all that is underscored by Shaw's art.
Yeah. At the end of this issue, there's a 2-page spread that is really phenomenal, and I think, but also contains inset panels that are bringing this issue to its climax. But that 2-page spread is really well done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one that I will definitely want to keep up with. And at the same time, it makes me feel bad that I didn't give Paybacks a try when it was at Dark Horse. I remember mentioning this on a previews episode, that first issue, but after that, I think I just kind of forgot about it.
Yeah, well, better late than never.
That's right. So if you were like us and did not read that 4-issue series from Dark Horse Comics, Definitely go back and pick that up. You can get that in trade. I think that trade came out earlier this year, and then get on over to Heavy Metal Comics and pick up issue number 1 of the Paybacks.
Yeah.
So 3 really interesting titles we discussed this week. We started off with Jules Feiffer's Cousin Joseph. After that, we looked at Kurtis, Wiebe, and Mindy Lee's Bounty number 1. And then we wrapped up with issue number 1, or was it 5, of Donny, Cates, and Eliot, Rahal, and Geoff Shaw's The Paybacks. All good stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. And if you want to find great titles such as these, then please head over to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Remember, dcbservice.com is the one-stop shop for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe, which is really easy to use. Or you can pick up the phone and call us the old-fashioned way. Go old school! Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on other areas of the social media sphere such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also listen to us on TuneIn and Spotify. And if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you know, you can always find every single one of the episodes that we've come out with, as well as read the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
Yeah, and we do like to hear from you. So we read a letter at the top of the show from Rock Langlois. Make sure that you follow his lead and send us an email. We do like to get your reaction from the shows that you enjoy. And even if you don't enjoy what we have to say, we appreciate hearing those as well.
That's right.
Yeah. We want to hear from you. And until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.